I guess the question for you, Comrade Briggs, is how do we ensure that the discourse that is currently happening on the cultural side of things and making sure that we're able to bring that to the conversation that we're having here this week? How do we make sure we don't lose out or don't isolate ourselves from that? Thanks.
Amandla. Maibuye. Africa. I must confess that this is the very first time that I'm chanting a slogan sitting down, whilst sitting down. It seems to work a little bit. Thanks, Jason. I think I want to start by just appreciating yourself and the whole Aphrodite team. I will not be exaggerating if I say my cup is almost full already. This is day one of the conference, but the richness that I have taken in from last night, the keynote address from our comrade Rogers Mackenzie, the various dimensions through which he expanded the frontiers of this conversation. And I want to particularly lift out the way he introduced the element of class analysis into this discourse. And I'm hoping that this is something that we will find time to engage in a much more considered manner as we continue with this struggle. One of the things that Roger said, Mackenzie said last night, was a very insightful interrogation of who owes who and who owes what. I remember him saying, we cannot, he first of all demonstrated how you had specific families. Some of those have remained very powerful families today, whether in the US Congress or in the House of the Lords in the UK, how they benefited from the exploitation of Africa. He went on to identify specific companies, corporates, global corporates, and how they benefited. And he went on to identify specific countries and nations and how they benefited. And he concluded that it would not be fair or just to make the working class in England responsible for the deaths of these elite families, of these global corporations, and of these nations that have exploited the continent. I'm speaking to it because it has not been a common occurrence in this discourse, just that element of introducing class analysis and class consciousness to how we're having this conversation. Further on, I was also really, really inspired and touched, or my cup was filled further by what I then had from our sister, Dina, I don't know if she's still here, when she spoke about the gendered dimensions to this discourse and how it tends to make things worse for the most vulnerable. And she cited the issue of women and girls and how they're affected. And this was emphasized even further in the conversations we had in our keynote speech this morning. The discussion that came in as well from our sister Atia that talked about how the very dynamics of debt have shifted. And she spoke a lot about this one individual company, Blackwater, if I'm not mistaken, could hold off a whole compromise or a whole resolution, because debt has shifted from what we knew in the past when it was bilateral debt to now privately owned debt. And our brother Opa came in and reminded us that there is a structural question that we need to engage with, and we cannot avoid to ignore that dimension if we are thinking of realizing the Agenda 2063. So I mean it, Jason, when I say I congratulate you and Tim for curating such a powerful program that on the first day, my cup is almost full. My cup is already full. So thank you and congratulations for the very powerful program. So getting into the conversation at hand, I want to maybe underline the significance of the moment. We heard it from our keynote speech this morning, that we are at this historically significant juncture when there is an adjudication of what becomes the next chapter of the global order, of world history. It's extremely significant, and I think this is a point that a lot of us have been talking about over the last year or the last 2 years. We have said that we are at the end of a historical cycle that begins in the post-World War II, so maybe 60, 70 years. And we are also at the beginning of a new historical cycle that will probably define world history for the next 50, 70 to 100 years. So that characterization of this moment as holding historical significance is very well established. But I think we can engage it further in terms of understanding some of the dynamics that play in when you are talking of a moment that holds that historical significance. I think the first thing is that everything breaks down in a moment like that. So even the ideas of the ruling class break down. They become exhausted. They no longer have the capacity to provide the stability that you need to sustain a global order. They become exhausted in that sense. Institutions that are built on the basis of those ideas become dysfunctional. And I think we are seeing the evidence. This is why the United Nations or multilateralism in general fails. It can no longer solve peace and security questions. It can no longer solve social and economic justice questions. It can no longer solve the most pressing questions that you need to be attended to for you to be able to have a stable global order. So we are at that moment where the ruling ideas have become exhausted. But what it also means is that even the norms, what you take to be the norms, when we speak in different platforms, sometimes we call it the normative frameworks, they also collapse. So things that we would have started to take for granted as norms, notions such as solidarity, they don't hold the same gravity that they held before. Notions such as truth, justice, fairness, all of these norms, they also collapse. So the normative collapses. And there's evidence that is plenty all around us to see that we are in a moment when the normative has collapsed. I'm always sharing with colleagues that the reasons that Marco Rubio, as the Secretary of State of the United States of America, gave for not going to a meeting of ministers of foreign affairs in Johannesburg in the lead up to the G20 was that South Africa had chosen solidarity as a theme for G20, together with sustainability and together with equity. And he said, this is a DEI agenda that we will not support. When I saw it for the first time, I thought it was one of those fake news and hoaxes. I had to go and Google and do all sorts of efforts to prove that it was actually true, that a global leader would stand up and question solidarity and question equity and question sustainability and question things that we are taking for granted here. So the norms collapse. Even last week or a few days ago, you would have heard Trump saying, you cannot take on a foe that is 10 times your size. This is Trump commenting on the Russia-Ukraine war. It's not about justice. It's about who has power. So in a moment like this, when things collapse, it's actually a moment that is characterized by brutality, historically. Like raw power, raw force and strength tends to actually get the better of the day. So it's not a moment where we can show up merely on the basis of the moral correctness of our assertions and of our claims. It's a moment where you really have to interrogate the question of power. And power in the sense of how do you get to achieve specific ends in the context of a contestation? Because this is what this moment is. It's a moment of global contestation. That's why moments like this historically have been characterized by war. It's been wars, protracted, drawn out, that have taken society to a certain level where there is maybe a decisive victor who then imposes their views, their vision, their dreams on the global order. This is what gives us the post-1945 world order. America had 80% of the world's money because gold was money at that point, and America had 80% of the world's gold reserves. They had more than 50% of the world's economy. They had the biggest, most intact global military force at that particular time. So when I hear Aphrodite say, Africa, the rule maker, in this moment, I'm asking myself, what do we have that is equivalent to what America had in the immediate post-Second World War moment that allowed them to then win and own and define the last 70 to 80 years of world history? They just didn't have moral vibes or justice vibes. There was something of a material dimension to power that they held that allowed them to own and win the world history and future in that sense. It's something that we need to really engage and interrogate in a fundamental sense. Let me come to this question that Jason has posed for us to say a reparative framework to engage in debt and where we are now. My sense is that reparations must start with a correct historical accounting. Today we are said to be the ones who owe. And it's a paradox because we are also the ones from whom a lot has been taken, more than we have received. So how is it that we are the ones who owe? So we must have a correct historical accounting. And I hope we have amongst us actuarial scientists, economists. Economists have told us that they can even give you a dollar figure of the value of life. And the way they calculate it is that they figure out how much you earn every hour or in a day, and then they figure out your life expectancy, and then they can work it out to actually say, if you die today, if you are killed today, you are owed $5,000, $10,000. That's how economists calculate these kinds of things. If you go to France, if you go to Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, he starts by talking of how Africa was on its own historical path that developed admirable civilizations in Mali, in Zimbabwe. It developed culture, it developed music, poetry, it developed art, it was developing trade mechanisms. There was a historical path that Africa was on. So we need to be able to calculate the cost of the disruption of that historical path. He goes further to talk about how the best of Africa, in terms of its youth, its most productive demography, was extracted in the slave trade period. So we need to be able to calculate the cost of losing that. He goes further to talk about the imposition of colonialism and what it meant to have our economies now restructured to simply serve as sources of raw material and sources of consuming products and goods and services that were not produced locally, but that were produced externally. And he goes further to talk about how, as a continent, we lost at a level that is cultural, at a level that is spiritual. And he goes further to talk about the neo-colonial subjugation of the continent. So our brother from who responded to the keynote this morning, it may be true that it's a daunting task to try and quantify this, because he said this is one of the reasons why we are told to forget and move away.
1 minute.
So landing this in 1 minute, we need to be able to have this historical accounting. Secondly, we need to be able to have restitution for what we have lost. What we have lost financially, what we have lost materially, what we have lost in terms of our trajectory, what we have lost spiritually. Honorable Chabalala this morning and her story of the golden stool. We need to be able to have restitution for what we have lost. Most importantly, we need to be able to have structural transformation or structural change that takes us to a place where we are not only saying there is no harm happening to the continent, but we are also saying we are preventing any further harm from taking place. And thirdly, we are repairing decisively the harm that has happened to us on all these dimensions. And the last thing that I would say, Jason, we are in Accra, we are in Ghana. This is the land of Kwame Nkrumah, as Ebrima said in the morning. This is the first country in sub-Saharan Africa to achieve independence. This is the cradle of Kwame Nkrumah's dream of African liberation. And I think it's only fitting to quote Kwame Nkrumah when he spoke of moments that hold the same historical significance as this moment holds. And he says, at that particular moment that we can relate to, he says, my countrymen, we stand before a moment of historical significance. It's a moment that calls for the courage to dream, the courage to dare, the courage to work, the courage to envision, the courage to achieve, the courage to achieve the greatest excellencies of man. Before then, or back then, we didn't used to say man or humanity, but it says to achieve the greatest excellencies of man. And he says, dare we ask for more from history. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.